For 41 years, the only thing anyone in Ardith, Oklahoma, knew for certain about Tomas Reynoso was that one day in 1978 he was working cattle on the Calder Ranch, and the next day he was gone. And that ranch hands like Tomas came and went, so no one looked very hard. For 41 years, that was the whole story. Then, on a single night in 2019, an old man dying in a county hospital told a chaplain where the body was, and a sheriff's crew tore up the floor of an old barn. And beneath it, under 4 decades of packed earth, they found a pair of boots and the man who'd worn them. That is not a story about a drifter who moved on. That is a story about a working man murdered and buried under a barn floor, and the 41 years of silence that finally broke in one night, when the man who'd kept it could carry it no further. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to the Oklahoma rangeland in the summer of 1978, and to the quiet ranch hand a whole county was content to forget. Ardith in 1978 sat in the rolling cattle country of western Oklahoma. Big sky and bluestem grass and red dirt, a ranching town of maybe 700, a feed store, a diner, a Baptist church, and the big spreads running cattle for miles in every direction. It was hard country and hard work, and the labor that ran the ranches was often migrant or transient. Hired hands who followed the work, many of them Mexican or Mexican-American. Men who came for a season or a few years and moved on, and who were, to the county that depended on them, largely invisible, here to work, and not much counted otherwise. Everyone knew the ranch families. The hands who did the work were another matter, and Tomas Reynoso was one of those hands. Tomas Reynoso was 31, a ranch hand who'd worked the Calder spread for 3 years, longer than most hands stayed anywhere. A steady, skilled cowboy who could break a green horse gentle, doctor a sick calf in the dark, and ride a fence line and leave it straighter than any man on the place. He'd come up from Texas, the son of a family that had crossed for work a generation before, and he sent money home faithfully to a mother and a younger sister across the border every month, folded into a letter. He meant he'd told the few hands he was close to save enough one day to buy a little piece of land of his own and stop working other men's cattle. He was quiet, devout, well-liked in the bunkhouse. A man who played guitar softly in the evenings while the others listened, without admitting they were listening. He had no family anywhere near Ardith, which is part of why his disappearance cost the county nothing. And Tomas had one thing the other hands knew him by: his boots, good handmade boots he'd saved the better part of a year to buy, the one fine thing he owned in the world, that he kept oiled and brushed and cared for like a prized horse, and that the other men ribbed him about gently. He'd said once those boots were the first thing he'd ever bought that was truly only his. In the summer of 1978, Tomas Reynoso was working the Calder Ranch, and then, between one day and the next, he was simply gone, and the county, accustomed to hands who drifted on, let him go. Here is what passed for a conclusion, which was barely anything at all. When Tomas didn't turn up for work, the foreman figured he'd moved on, the way hands did, drawn his pay, or not bothered to, and headed to the next ranch or back to Texas. There was no family in town to raise an alarm, no one filing a frantic report, no one demanding a search. His few belongings left in the bunkhouse were no cause for concern. Transient men traveled light and sometimes left things. His mother and sister in Mexico, when his letters and money stopped, had no way to reach into an Oklahoma county that had never registered their son as anything but a pair of hands, and their distant, grieving inquiries, to the extent they could even make them across a border and a language, went nowhere. Within a season, it was settled without anyone deciding it. Tomas Reynoso had drifted off the way they do. No search, no report worth the name. A working man simply subtracted from a county that had never added him. The detail that should have troubled someone was the boots, though no one who could act on it knew. Tomas Reynoso would no more have left without his boots, the one fine thing he owned, oiled and cared for, than man leaves without his feet. The other hands knew it. One of them said as much, that Tomas wouldn't have gone anywhere without those boots, and certainly wouldn't have left them in the bunkhouse. But the word of a fellow ranch hand, another transient brown man with no standing, against a county's comfortable assumption that hands drift on, weighed nothing. The boots, as it had happened, had not been left in the bunkhouse at all. They'd gone into the ground with him. There was no dogged daughter here, no sister in town with a notebook, no investigator who couldn't sleep. Tomas's family was far away and powerless. The county did not care. The other hands moved on with the seasons. For 41 years, there was no one pushing at all. The silence was total. The only person who knew what had happened kept it, and the only thing that could break the case was that man's conscience, which for 41 years held. The institutional failure here was the deepest kind. A death that generated no investigation whatsoever because the victim was a transient migrant worker that a county simply did not value enough wonder about. There was no botched search to point to because there was no search. Tomas Reynoso vanished into the gap reserved for people the system has decided don't merit the looking. No family with standing, no community with power, no official obligation felt. His killer didn't have to hide much of anything. The county's indifference was all the cover required. Then the case went cold, the way a thing goes cold that was never warm. The seasons turned. The hands changed. The Calder Ranch ran on. Tomas Reynoso became not even a story, just an absence no one in Ardith had ever really noticed. A name remembered, if at all, only by an aging mother and sister across a border, who died not knowing what had become of him. By 1988, 10 years had passed. The Calder Ranch had passed from Old Man Calder to his sons, the cattle operation rolling on the way it always had. The barn where the hands had worked the cattle that summer still stood, its floor packed hard by decades of boots and hooves. The hands of 1978 had scattered across other ranches and other states, or gone home to Texas and Mexico, taking their memories of a quiet guitar-playing cowboy with them. Tomas's family in Mexico had finally stopped sending the inquiries that had never once gotten a real answer from anyone in the North, and had settled into grieving a son and brother who had simply vanished across the border, his fate an open wound precisely because it never closed, never had a shape. By 2010, the old Calder Ranch had been sold out of the family, and the big spread broken into parcels. But the original working barn from the 70s still stood on one of them, owned now by new people who knew nothing of who had worked there or what lay beneath its floor. The men who'd worked the place in 1978 were old now, or dead. And one of them, a man named Earl Doss, who'd been a young hand on the Calder place that summer, carried into his old age a thing he had never told a living soul, a thing he had been part of, or near to, and had buried inside himself for over 40 years under fear and shame and the long, practiced silence of a man who'd learned early that some things you do not say. Every case we cover on this channel represents weeks of digging through records, court files, and the lives of people who deserve to be remembered. If you want us to keep telling these stories the way they ought to be told, take a second to like this video, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. It honestly is what keeps this channel going. Now, let's get back to Tomas. The 41 years of silence broke in a single night. In 2019, Earl Doss, now in his 70s, dying of heart failure in the county hospital in Ardith, asked a chaplain to sit with him, and over the course of one long night told the chaplain that he could not die without telling someone what had happened to a man named Tomas Reynoso in the summer of 1978. He said where the body was. The chaplain, shaken, brought in the sheriff before the night was out. By the time the sheriff had what he needed, Earl Doss was failing fast. But he held on long enough to give the location plainly. Under the floor of the old Calder barn, in a particular corner where they dug down and buried him and packed the earth and never spoken of it again. Here is the truth of how this case broke, and there was no technology in the breaking of it. Only a dying man's conscience, arriving at the very end. A deathbed account is not proof on its own, but Earl Doss gave a specific place, and the only way to test it was to dig. A sheriff's recovery crew went to the old barn, tore up the floorboards in the corner the dying man had named, and dug down through 4 decades of packed red earth. And there, where Earl Doss said he would be, were human remains, and with them, the leather cracked and the soles rotted, but the shape unmistakable. A pair of fine handmade cowboy boots. There was no family in Ardith to call, but the recovery and the publicity reached across the border at last to Tomas Reynoso's surviving sister, an old woman now in Mexico, who had grieved a brother vanished into the north for 41 years. And to her, after all that time, came the word that her brother had been found, exactly where a dying man's confession had said, beneath a barn floor in Oklahoma, with the boots he'd been so proud of still on his feet. She had never stopped wondering. The wondering, at least, was over. A body buried under a barn meant a murder, and Earl Doss's account named who had done it. Doss said he had been a young hand, terrified and complicit only in the silence after, and that the killing had been the work of the ranch's foreman that summer, a man named Wesley Garrett, over wages and a grievance, that Tomas had confronted Garrett about pay being held back from the hands. Money Garrett was skimming, and that Garrett had killed Tomas in a rage and forced the few hands who knew, Doss among them, to help bury him under the barn and swear to silence, with threats that a young migrant hand in 1978 Oklahoma had every reason to believe. Doss had kept that silence for 41 years, and it had eaten him alive, and in the end he could not take it into the ground. Wesley Garrett, the case found, had died years before. An old rancher never suspected, who'd taken his crime to his own grave thinking it buried for good. But the investigation did not end there. Doss's account and the recovered remains, and the old ranch's surviving wage records, established the wage-skimming motive and the murder. And there had been a second man, younger, who'd helped Garrett that night and gone on to a prosperous local life. A man named Lyle Trask, now in his late 60s, still living, who had spent 4 decades as a respected figure in the county, with no one ever knowing his part in a buried man under a barn. With Doss's deathbed statement, the remains and the corroborating records, Lyle Trask was confronted, and the long silence finally collapsed. He was arrested in 2019 in connection with the murder and concealment of Tomas Reynoso. When the truth came out, Ardith had to reckon with something it had spent 41 years not even noticing. The arrest shocked the county. But the deeper, harder thing was the realization of how completely Tomas Reynoso had been allowed to disappear, how a working man had been murdered and buried under a barn in their midst, and not one official question had ever been asked. Because the man was a migrant hand the county hadn't valued enough to wonder about. The silence that hid the crime hadn't only been the killer's. It had been the whole county's indifference. Lyle Trask was charged in 2019. The case became a reckoning the county had avoided for 2 generations. Tomas Reynoso's remains were returned to his family in Mexico, to the sister who'd grieved him for 41 years, and buried at last near the mother who died waiting, with the fine handmade boots he'd been so proud of, the first thing he ever owned that was truly his. And a man the county had let vanish without a search, without a question, without a care, was finally accounted for, and named and brought home. Tomas Reynoso was 31 years old. He could break a horse and doctor a calf and mend a fence straighter than any man on the place. He sent his wages home to his mother and sister. He played guitar by the bunkhouse at dusk, and he was saving for a little land of his own. He did not drift off the way hands do. He was murdered for confronting a foreman about stolen wages and buried under a barn floor, and the county never even looked, because it had never counted him as someone who could be missed. There was no relative on the scene who fought for him, no detective who carried his file. There was only, in the end, a dying man who could not bear his own silence, and a sister across a border who never stopped wondering. 41 years of silence broke in one night, and a man no one had looked for was found. It makes you wonder, how many migrant and transient workers, decades ago, simply vanished without a single question asked, because the people who relied on their labor did not value their lives enough to wonder where they'd gone. How many bodies are under old barns, old fields, old foundations, kept by the silence of people too afraid or too complicit to speak? And what does it take for a man to carry a buried secret for 41 years? And what does it cost him to finally set it down? Tell us in the comments, do you think Tomas Reynoso would ever have been found if Earl Doss had died with his secret instead of confessing? What detail stayed with you most? The boots he was so proud of, the wages he died confronting, the sister who grieved across a border for 41 years. And how many disappeared workers from that era do you believe are still under the ground? No one ever searched. Justice came for Tomas Reynoso after 41 years, given up in a single night by a dying man's conscience and a barn floor torn open. Stories like his remind us that the people a society fails to value are still owed the truth, that even 41 years of silence can break in one night, and that being found, named, and brought home to the family who never stopped wondering is its own form of justice. If you believe that too, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved cold cases are waiting in the description. Thank you for watching.